She was the last girl on the auction block until a stranger whispered, "I'll take her." The words cut through the harsh desert wind like a blade, stopping every conversation in the dusty town square of Copper Ridge. The year was 1867, and this was not how things were supposed to go. Not even here. Martha Elizabeth Hayes stood on that wooden platform, feeling 100 pairs of eyes on her, like a physical weight. Her chin was high, a useless little piece of defiance against the storm that was her life. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She was 19, with golden hair the sun loved, and a spirit that had, until this very moment, refused to break. The auctioneer, Silas Granger, was a sweaty, desperate man. For an hour his voice had scraped against the silence. "Any offers for Miss Hayes?" he'd bellowed. "A fine cook, can sew, knows her letters." He was selling her like a prize sow, a piece of property to be managed. Her father's death in the mines had left nothing but debt. Her mother's fever had left nothing but a cold grave. The town council, in their infinite frontier wisdom, had decided this was the only way. The crowd of miners and ranchers shifted on their dusty boots. Most had wives. The rest were too poor to feed another mouth. The few bachelors looked away, more interested in the fleeting comforts of the saloon than the permanent responsibility of a woman like her. The silence stretched, thin and cruel. It was the end of the line. Then he moved. He'd been a shadow against the general store's porch, hat pulled low, a ghost no one had noticed ride in on a stallion the color of old blood. He was tall, lean, and cut from the same harsh landscape as the mountains on the horizon. His clothes were dark, well made, but coated in the dust of a long journey. "I'll take her," he said again, his voice quiet but carrying a strange authority that made the air crackle. Granger's eyes, small and piggy, lit up with a pathetic sort of relief. "Well now, that's more like it. And you are, sir?" The stranger pushed off the porch post and walked toward the platform. The crowd parted for him, as if he carried his own invisible barrier. Martha got her first good look at him then. His eyes were a shocking, piercing blue, set in a face weathered by sun and secrets. Dark hair, with a slash of gray at the temples. He looked dangerous, but as his eyes met hers, she felt something else too. Something that made no sense. Protection. "Name's Jacob Thornton," he said, his voice a low rumble. He reached into his coat, and for a heart-stopping second, Martha thought he was reaching for a gun. Instead, he pulled out a thick leather pouch. Reverend Morrison, the town's moral compass, stepped forward, his face a mask of worry. "And what exactly are your intentions, Mr. Thornton?" Jacob's gaze never left Martha. It was unnerving, like he was seeing right through her skin and into her soul. "My intentions are honorable, Reverend. I need a housekeeper for my ranch. Miss Hayes looks like she could use a fresh start." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I'll offer fair wages, her own quarters, and the respect due to any lady." Hope, a fragile and foolish thing, fluttered in Martha's chest. It was better than the alternative, better than the leering stares of the other men. This Jacob Thornton, for all his hard edges, spoke like a gentleman. But Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, and a man who trusted nothing he couldn't hammer into shape, wasn't convinced. "How do we know you're not some drifter, looking to take advantage?" Jacob didn't answer with words. He tossed the leather pouch onto the platform. It landed with a heavy, final thud. The clink of coins was deafening in the silence. $50, Jacob stated, his voice flat, "to settle her father's debts. The rest is an advance on her wages." He turned his piercing gaze on Bradley. "I own the Double T Ranch. 2 days' ride north. I have land, cattle, and a house that needs looking after. Are there any other questions?" No one spoke. $50 was a fortune, more money than most of them would see in a year. The weight of those coins settled everything. Reverend Morrison looked at Martha, his expression softening. "What do you say, child? Are you willing to go with this man?" Martha looked at Jacob Thornton. She saw the hardness, the danger, but she also saw that flicker of something else in his blue eyes, a deep, buried sorrow that resonated with her own. It was a long shot, a gamble in a life that had already dealt her nothing but bad hands, but it was the only hand she had left to play. "I am," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, and just like that, her life was sold. Within the hour, she was on the seat of his wagon, her small trunk of meager possessions bouncing in the back. The town of Copper Ridge, the only home she'd ever known, shrank behind them until it was nothing more than a smudge of dust and regret on the horizon. The first day was shrouded in a thick, uncomfortable silence. Jacob Thornton was not a man for small talk. He drove the horses with a grim focus, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if he were expecting an attack at any moment. When they stopped, he was courteous but distant, helping her down, offering her water, but his movements were stiff, his words clipped. That night, he built a fire with an unsettling efficiency. He moved with the quiet deadliness of a predator, every action precise and wasted. As they ate a meager meal of beans and hardtack, the firelight danced across his face, carving deep shadows into the lines around his eyes. Martha couldn't stand the silence any longer. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, her voice small against the vast emptiness of the prairie. Jacob looked up, his blue eyes catching the firelight and gleaming like chips of ice. "It has potential," he said after a long pause. "Good water, decent herd. The house, it needs work." He stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. "My wife, she used to—" He trailed off, the words dying in his throat. "You were married?" Martha asked softly, sensing a deep well of pain. "Sarah," he said, the name a raw wound, "died 2 years ago. Fever. Took our baby too." His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "Haven't had much use for keeping a house since. Been living rough." An ache of sympathy bloomed in Martha's chest. She knew that kind of loss, the hollowness it leaves behind. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He just nodded, his jaw tight. "That's why I need help," he said, but his eyes were distant, looking at something far beyond the fire. "Need to remember how to live again, I suppose." But something about his story felt wrong, rehearsed. The grief was there. She could feel it radiating from him like heat, but the words felt like a script he had recited many times. It was a small thing, a flicker of doubt in the back of her mind, but it was there. The next 2 days were more of the same. Long stretches of silence broken only by Jacob pointing out a landmark or naming a distant mountain range. He seemed to know the land intimately, yet he moved through it like a stranger, always watchful, always tense. He gave her a small, sharp knife on the second day. "For protection," he said, his eyes scanning the empty plains around them. "From what?" she asked, her hand closing around the cold steel. "This is hard country," was all he said, leaving her to wonder if the danger was from wild animals, or something else entirely. Maybe even from him. On the afternoon of the third day, he pulled the wagon to a halt on a high ridge overlooking a sweeping valley. "There it is," he said, a note of something, pride, relief, in his voice. Martha gasped. The Double T Ranch wasn't just beautiful, it was breathtaking. A sturdy log house with a wide porch sat nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees by a sparkling creek. Cattle dotted the distant pastures. It was an oasis of civilization in the middle of a vast wilderness. It was perfect. Too perfect. "It's wonderful," she breathed, trying to ignore the prickle of unease on her skin. A rare, fleeting smile touched Jacob's lips. "The house is bigger than it looks. Sarah and we planned on filling it with children." The smile vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Your room is downstairs. Kitchen's got a good stove. There's a parlor with a piano." As they drew closer, she saw that his description had been a lie. The yard wasn't overgrown. The porch was swept clean. The windows sparkled in the afternoon sun. There were no signs of a man living alone in grief. The place was immaculate, maintained with a meticulous, almost obsessive care. The flower beds were weeded, though nothing was planted. It was a home waiting for someone to arrive. "I should warn you," he said as he helped her down, his grip on her arm surprisingly tight. "I haven't been much of a housekeeper." It was another lie. The inside of the house was spotless, dust-free. The floors were scrubbed, the furniture polished, but it was cold, sterile, It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a stage, perfectly set, waiting for the play to begin. It smelled of lemon oil and loneliness. Where? Where was Sarah's room? Martha asked, her voice a near whisper. Jacob's face became a stone mask. Upstairs, he said, his voice dropping. I haven't been up there since she died. His eyes dared her to question him. Then he pointed to a door off the kitchen. Your room is in there. It was meant to be the nursery. He carried her trunk inside and set it at the foot of a simple, clean bed. The room was pleasant, with a window overlooking the valley. But as Martha looked around, her blood ran cold. On the bed, neatly folded, was a simple calico dress. A nightgown lay beside it. In the wardrobe, other clothes hung, all in her size. A pair of worn boots sat on the floor, looking as if they would fit her feet perfectly. It wasn't a room for a new housekeeper. It was a room prepared for her. He had been expecting her. Not just any housekeeper, but someone exactly her size, exactly her build. The $50 in town hadn't been an act of charity. It had been a purchase. He hadn't just bought her freedom from debt. He had bought her. And as he stood in the doorway, his piercing blue eyes watching her, she understood. She was a prisoner in this beautiful empty house, and she had no idea why. The days that followed were a quiet, nerve-wracking torment. Martha fell into a routine that felt surreal. She would wake, cook breakfast for a silent Jacob, and then clean a house that was already spotless. She swept clean floors, dusted polished furniture, and tended a garden that was perfectly tilled but barren. It was all a performance, and she didn't know her lines. Jacob was a ghost in his own home. He would leave before sunrise and return after sunset, his face always grim, his silence a heavy blanket over the house. He treated her with a cold, detached courtesy. He never raised his voice, never made an inappropriate gesture, but she felt his eyes on her constantly. When she walked the porch, when she gathered eggs from the hen house, she felt his gaze from the barn or the edge of the woods. She was a specimen in a jar. He gave her only one rule, one single command, delivered in a voice that left no room for argument. Do not go upstairs, Martha, ever. The upstairs of the house became an obsession. It was a locked box in the center of her new life, and she was desperate to know what was inside. Was it truly just a dead woman's room, preserved in grief? Or was it something else? The source of the lies, the key to why she was really here. She tried to piece together the puzzle from the clues around her. The house was well stocked, but only with staples. Beans, flour, salted pork. No luxuries, no personal touches. It was a fortress, not a home. In a drawer in the kitchen, tucked beneath a stack of dish towels, she found a man's wedding band, identical to the one Jacob wore. Why would a widower keep a spare? One afternoon, while Jacob was out mending a far fence line, she found a book on the parlor table. A collection of poetry. It looked new. On the inside cover, in elegant, looping script, was an inscription. To my dearest Sarah, my sun, my moon, my stars, forever yours, J. The date was only 3 months ago. 2 years, he had said. His wife had been dead for 2 years. Another lie. The lies were piling up, building the walls of her prison higher and higher. He wasn't a grieving widower. He was something else. A liar, a captor, and she was completely at his mercy, miles from anyone. A ghost in a dead woman's house. The breaking point came a week later. A storm rolled in from the mountains, a furious, black-hearted tempest that shook the house to its foundations. Rain lashed against the windows and wind howled through the cottonwoods like a dying animal. Jacob hadn't returned. He was out with the herd, caught in the deluge. Martha sat in the kitchen, the knife he had given her on the table in front of her, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. The storm was a reflection of the tempest in her own soul. Fear and curiosity warred within her, a battle that had been raging since she arrived. And then she heard it, a sound from directly above her, from upstairs. Cree-eek, a floorboard. The sound was faint, almost lost in the howl of the wind, but it was unmistakable. Someone was walking around up there, in the forbidden room. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Jacob was gone. She was supposed to be alone. Was someone else in the house? Had someone broken in? Or was the house haunted by the ghost of the woman whose clothes she wore? She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, her knuckles white. She had to know. The rule, the one command he had given her, no longer mattered. Her survival might depend on what was up those stairs. Taking a deep breath, she lit a lantern, the flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She moved out of the kitchen and stood at the bottom of the staircase, her heart a frantic drum in her ears. The wood looked dark and foreboding. Each step was a step into the unknown, a step towards the heart of Jacob Thornton's lies. One step at a time she began to climb, the poker held out in front of her like a sword. The old wood groaned under her weight, each sound an explosion in the terrifying silence between gusts of wind. The air grew colder as she ascended, a strange, still cold that had nothing to do with the storm outside. She reached the top of the stairs. A long, dark hallway stretched before her. Only one door was closed, the one at the very end, the source of the sound. Her hand trembled as she reached for the cold brass knob. She turned it slowly, wincing at the click of the latch. Pushing the door open, she raised the lantern, its light spilling into the room beyond. And she froze, a scream trapped in her throat. The room was not a dusty, forgotten shrine to a dead wife. It was pristine. A large four-poster bed, neatly made. A vanity table with silverback brushes laid out in a perfect row. The air smelled faintly of lavender, fresh and clean. It was as if its occupant had just stepped out for a moment. But that wasn't what made her blood turn to ice. On the bedside table, next to a book left open, was a silver picture frame, turned face down. A strange, deliberate act. With a shaking hand, Martha reached out and turned it over. The portrait was of a smiling couple, standing in front of this very house. One was Jacob, looking younger, happier. The other was a woman with golden hair and a familiar smile. A woman named Sarah. Martha's knees went weak. The woman in the picture was her. It wasn't a resemblance. It wasn't a passing similarity. It was her face, her eyes, her smile, staring back at her from a life that wasn't hers. She was an exact, perfect, impossible double. A wave of nausea and terror washed over her. Who was she? What was this place? Was she going mad? Had Jacob brought her here because she looked like his dead wife? Was he a madman, lost in his grief, trying to resurrect a ghost? She stumbled backwards, dropping the picture frame with a clatter. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She had to get out. She had to run now into the storm, anywhere but here. She turned to flee, back down the stairs, back out the door, and ran straight into a solid wall of a man. Jacob. He stood there dripping wet, his face dark and unreadable in the flickering lantern light. He must have come in while she was upstairs. He hadn't been angry. He hadn't been surprised. His piercing blue eyes were filled with a grim, chilling resignation. "I told you not to come up here, Martha," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He knew. He knew she would break the rule. He had been waiting for it. The trap had just sprung. "Who is she?" Martha whispered, her voice trembling as she pointed a shaking finger at the fallen portrait on the floor. "Why do I look just like her?" Jacob's expression didn't change. The cold, hard mask remained in place, but Martha could see a storm of emotion raging in the depths of his blue eyes. He took a step into the room, his wet boots silent on the polished floorboards, and gently closed the door behind him, shutting them in together. The click of the latch echoed the closing of a cell door. "Her name is Sarah," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the pained grief he had feigned before. "And she is my wife." "Is?" Martha seized on the word. "You said she was dead. You lied to me." "I've lied about many things, Martha," he admitted, his gaze unwavering. "Lying was necessary, but she is not dead. Not yet." He walked over to the window and stared out at the raging storm, his back to her. "A year ago, a man named Silas Kane and his gang rode through this valley. They were horse thieves, killers, the worst kind of scum. But Kane was more than just a common outlaw. He was obsessed with beauty, with possessing it." He paused, and the silence was filled only by the drumming of the rain. He saw Sarah in the yard. He came back that night. I fought, but there were too many of them. They took her, and they left me for dead. Martha stared at his back, the pieces of the puzzle starting to slam into place, forming a picture more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. The immaculate house, the spare wedding ring, the fresh inscription in the book. It wasn't grief, it was waiting. They think I'm dead, Jacob continued, his voice a low growl of pure, condensed hatred. Cain wants this ranch. He wants everything that was mine. He's been biding his time, but my sources tell me he's coming back. Soon. He plans to move in, with Sarah, and live here as if it's his own. He turned around then, and the look on his face made Martha take an involuntary step back. It was the face of a man who had been to hell and was willing to drag everyone else back down with him. That's why you're here, he said, the words hitting her like stones. That's why I bought you. The truth, raw and brutal, hung in the air between them. I don't understand, she whispered, though she was beginning to. Cain's men have been watching this valley for months, Jacob explained, his voice cold and clinical. Scouts, hidden in the hills. They needed to see life here. They needed to believe the grieving widower's story, that I'd fled or died of a broken heart. And then they needed to see her. He gestured around the pristine room. They needed to see Sarah back in the house, living, breathing, alone. Martha felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. You used me. I am using you, he corrected her, without a trace of remorse. From the moment I saw you on that auction block, I knew. It was a sign, a chance I never thought I'd have. You were the perfect lure. He hadn't rescued her. He hadn't offered her a fresh start. He had bought a piece of bait, a human decoy. Every moment since she had arrived had been a lie, a carefully constructed stage play designed to fool the killers watching from the hills. And she was the star, with no idea she was even in a show. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice shaking with a mixture of terror and white-hot fury. I want you to be my wife, he said. For the next 48 hours, you will wear her clothes, you will walk in the yard, you will sit on the porch. You will make them believe that Sarah is here, vulnerable and alone. You will draw Silas Cain into this house. He moved towards a large wardrobe in the corner of the room and opened it. It was filled with rifles, shotguns, and boxes of ammunition. The entire ranch wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. It was an elaborate, deadly trap. And when he walks through that door, Jacob finished, his hand resting on the stock of a Winchester rifle, I will be waiting. Martha's mind reeled. This was insane. He was asking her to risk her life, to be the cheese in a mousetrap for a gang of murderers, all to save a woman she'd never met, a woman whose face she now wore. And what if I say no? She challenged, finding a sliver of her old defiance. What if I run? Jacob's cold eyes met hers. Where would you go, Martha? Into the storm? On foot? Cain's men are out there. They'd find you before you got a mile. And when they see your face, what do you think they'll do to you? He was right. She was trapped. Trapped between a cold, manipulative man using her as a pawn and a gang of killers who would see her as a prize. There was no escape. Her life, which had been sold for $50, was now worth nothing at all. So that's it? She said, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. I'm just a tool for your revenge. For the first time, a flicker of something other than cold determination crossed his face. It looked almost like regret. I am sorry for the deception, Martha. I truly am. I will not lie to you anymore. This is a dangerous plan, and you might not survive it, but it is the only plan I have. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to an intense, almost pleading whisper. Help me. Help me get my wife back. And I swear on her life, I will see you safely away from here, with enough money to start a new life anywhere you choose. She stared into his desperate blue eyes. He was a monster, a manipulator who had bought and used her without a second thought. But he was also a husband, fighting to save the woman he loved. In his brutal, unforgiving world, this monstrous plan was his only path. And it was her only path, too. She had a choice, a terrible, impossible choice: to be a victim or to be a weapon, to die running or to fight for a chance to live. Looking at the rifle in his hand and then at the portrait on the floor, she made her decision. She would play the part. She would be Sarah. She would help him spring his trap, but she would do it on her own terms. The next 24 hours were the longest of Martha's life. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. But inside the house, the air was thick with a tension so palpable it felt like she was breathing water. Jacob laid out his plan with the cold precision of a general preparing for a battle he knew he might not survive. He showed her the hidden rifle ports he'd built into the walls, the tripwires near the barn, the way the floorboards in the parlor were weakened to give way under a man's weight. The entire ranch was a weapon waiting to be fired. Her role was simple, yet terrifying. She was to be visible. She was to be the picture of a lonely woman, tending to her home, waiting. She wore one of Sarah's dresses, a simple blue cotton that fit like a second skin. When she looked in the mirror, Sarah's face looked back, haunted by Martha's eyes. Jacob watched her, his expression a mixture of grim satisfaction and something she couldn't name. Guilt, perhaps. He taught her how to hold a pistol, how to load it, how its weight felt in her hand. "You will not be defenseless," he told her, his voice rough. "When the fighting starts, you get to the kitchen cellar. Bar the door. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." That afternoon, she walked out into the yard, forcing herself to move with a calm she did not feel. She hung laundry on the line, her hands shaking so badly she could barely clip the pins. She felt them, the eyes. She couldn't see anyone, but she could feel the unseen observers in the high rocks overlooking the valley. She was a fish in a barrel, and the hunters were watching, waiting for the right moment to shoot. Later, she sat on the porch swing, a book open in her lap, pretending to read. The sun was warm. The birds were singing. It was a beautiful, perfect day for a bloodbath. Jacob was a shadow moving between the house and the barn, making his final preparations. They barely spoke. There was nothing left to say. They were partners in a deadly conspiracy, bound together by desperation and deceit. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jacob came to her on the porch. He handed her a cup of coffee, his fingers brushing against hers. The brief touch sent a jolt through her. "They'll come after dark," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the darkening hills. "Cain likes the dark. He thinks it's his friend." "Are you ready?" she asked, her own voice a stranger's. He nodded slowly. "I've been ready for a year." He looked at her then, truly looked at her. Not as a tool or a decoy, but as a person. "You are brave, Martha Hayes. Braver than you know." "I'm not brave," she whispered, staring into her coffee cup. "I'm terrified." "Bravery isn't the absence of fear," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "It's acting in spite of it." They sat in silence as the last of the light bled from the sky and a blanket of stars appeared. Every rustle of leaves, every hoot of a distant owl sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through Martha's veins. This was it. The performance was over. The curtain was about to rise on the final bloody act. The sound came around midnight. The soft, rhythmic creak of saddle leather, the muffled hoof beats of several horses approaching slowly, cautiously. Martha's heart leaped into her throat. Jacob, who had been sitting in a darkened corner of the porch, stood up, melting back into the shadows of the house without a sound. She was alone. The bait. She forced herself to remain seated, to keep her breathing even. The plan was for her to look surprised, frightened, but not panicked. She had to lure Cain onto the porch, into the house. 5 figures emerged from the darkness, dismounting by the gate. They moved with a swaggering confidence, dark shapes against the starlight. One man was clearly the leader. He was taller, broader than the others, and he walked towards the house as if he already owned it. Silas Cain. "Sarah, my love," he called out, his voice a greasy, confident drawl. "No need to be frightened. I've come back for you, just like I promised." Martha stood up slowly, letting the book fall to the floor. She wrapped her arms around herself, making herself look small, vulnerable. "Silas?" she breathed, pitching her voice to sound shaky, just as Jacob had instructed. Cain laughed, a low, ugly sound. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his face tilting up into the faint moonlight. He was a handsome man, in a cruel, predatory way. The one and only. Did you miss me? I know I missed you. This place, it's a fine place, but it was empty without you. He took a step up onto the porch. Where is he? Your husband. Still rotting where I left him? He's gone, Martha whispered, letting a tear trace a path down her cheek. He died months ago. It was the final lie, the one that was meant to seal his fate. A slow, triumphant smile spread across Kane's face. Is that so? A pity. He sounded anything but pitiful. He took another step, reaching for her. Well, no matter. I'm the man of the house now. He was just a few feet away, close enough for her to smell the whiskey on his breath. This was the signal. It's a shame you came all this way, she said, her voice suddenly clear and cold, dropping the frightened act. Kane's smile faltered. He frowned in confusion. What did you say? And then all hell broke loose. The first shot came from the barn, a deafening roar that shattered the night. One of Kane's men by the gate screamed and crumpled to the ground. The others scrambled for cover, pulling their guns, firing blindly into the darkness. Kane grabbed Martha, pulling her in front of him as a human shield. Trap! He roared at his men. It's a trap! He pressed the cold muzzle of his pistol to her temple. Martha's training with Jacob kicked in. She didn't panic. She drove her heel down hard on Kane's instep. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She slammed her elbow back into his ribs and threw herself sideways, rolling across the porch and scrambling behind a thick wooden pillar, just as a rifle shot from inside the house splintered the wood where her head had been. Gunshots erupted from everywhere. From the barn, from the windows of the house, from the hayloft. Jacob's planning was perfect. He had turned the ranch into a killing field, and Kane's gang had walked right into the middle of it. Men were screaming, falling. It was chaos, a symphony of violence and death under the cold, indifferent stars. Kane, realizing he'd been outmaneuvered, fired wildly towards the house before turning to run. But Jacob was ready. The parlor window shattered, and Jacob vaulted through it, landing in a crouch on the porch, his rifle already leveled. The two men, the husband and the thief, faced each other. Thornton! Kane spat, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. They told me you were dead. You should have made sure, Jacob said, his voice deadly calm. Kane raised his pistol, but he was too slow. Jacob's rifle bucked against his shoulder. The shot was deafeningly close. Kane staggered back, a look of pure shock on his face, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He collapsed to his knees, then pitched forward onto the porch floor, dead. Silence fell, as sudden and shocking as the violence had been. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. It was over. Jacob stood over Kane's body for a long moment, his chest heaving. Then he looked at Martha, who was still crouched behind the pillar, her heart pounding like a drum. His face was unreadable. He had won. He had his revenge. But the night wasn't finished with its secrets. From the darkness beyond the barn, a single terrified scream cut through the night. A woman's scream. Jacob's head snapped up. His face, which had been grimly satisfied, now twisted into a mask of pure horror. No, he whispered. He wasn't supposed to have her here. Without another word to Martha, he vaulted over the porch railing and sprinted towards the sound, towards a small, hidden line shack near the creek that hadn't been part of his plan. He had been so sure Kane would come alone. He had been wrong. Martha hesitated for only a second. She grabbed the pistol Jacob had given her from where it had fallen on the porch. The cellar. He had told her to go to the cellar and hide. But she couldn't. Not now. This wasn't just his fight anymore. She followed him into the darkness, her bare feet flying over the blood-soaked ground. She reached the line shack just as Jacob kicked the door in. Inside, a single lantern cast a hellish yellow glow. Two of Kane's men, who had been left behind as guards, were there, and cowering in the corner, bound to a chair, was a woman with wild, terrified eyes and golden hair. Sarah, the real Sarah. One of the men lunged at Jacob. They crashed to the floor in a brutal tangle of limbs. The other man saw Martha in the doorway. He grinned, a nasty, broken-tooth snarl, and raised his pistol. Martha didn't think. She raised her own gun, both hands gripping the butt to steady it, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the small space. The man's grin vanished, replaced by a look of stupid surprise. He crumpled to the floor. Jacob, meanwhile, had finished his own fight. He got to his feet, breathing heavily, and turned to the woman in the chair. He rushed to her, cutting her ropes with his knife. "Sarah," he breathed, his voice thick with a year of pain and longing. "Sarah, it's me. You're safe." He pulled her into his arms. But the reunion Martha had expected, the emotional embrace of rescued love, never happened. Sarah Thornton trembled in his arms, but she did not hug him back. She stared past him, her eyes wide and vacant, landing on Martha standing in the doorway, holding the smoking pistol. Sarah looked from Martha's face to Jacob's, and then back again. A slow, dawning horror filled her eyes. She saw the impossible reflection. The woman wearing her dress, her face. She saw the brutal, bloody reality of what her husband had done to get her back. She began to scream, a raw, ragged sound of pure, unadulterated terror. She wasn't screaming because of the outlaws. She was screaming at the sight of her husband and her own ghost, standing together over a pile of dead men. In that moment, Martha understood. Jacob had won the battle. He had gotten his revenge and rescued his wife. But he had just lost the war. He hadn't just brought Sarah back from captivity. He had brought her back to a nightmare of his own making. The weeks that followed the night of the attack were quiet and strange. The authorities came from the nearest town, asked their questions, and left. Satisfied that justice had been served at the Double T, Jacob was a hero. The man who had single-handedly destroyed the notorious Kane gang. But inside the ranch house, there was no victory. Sarah was a ghost. She moved through the pristine rooms like a stranger, her eyes holding a permanent look of haunted fear. She barely spoke. She flinched when Jacob tried to touch her. The woman he had fought and killed for was gone, replaced by this fragile, broken creature who looked at him with the eyes of a stranger. She looked at Martha with something even worse, a mixture of terror and accusation. Martha had moved her belongings into a small room in the barn. She couldn't stay in the house, couldn't wear Sarah's clothes or sleep in the room that had been prepared for her. The entire house felt like a tomb, heavy with unspoken words and shattered dreams. She helped with the ranch work, keeping her distance, giving the couple a space that they didn't know how to fill. One evening, Jacob found her by the corral, staring at the sunset. "She's leaving," he said, his voice hollow. He didn't have to say who. "Her father is coming from back east to take her home. She says this land is cursed, that I am cursed." "I'm sorry, Jacob," Martha said, and she meant it. "I did it for her," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "Everything I did, the lies, the plan, using you. It was all to get her back." He finally looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a deep, weary sorrow. "I destroyed everything to save her, and in the end, I lost her anyway." He had gotten his revenge, but it had cost him his soul. The day Sarah left was bright and sunny. Her father, a stern, wealthy-looking man in a city suit, barely looked at Jacob. He helped his daughter into a comfortable carriage he'd hired, and they rode out of the valley without a single look back. The Double T Ranch was quiet once more, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't the tense, waiting silence of before. It was an empty, aching void. That night, Jacob came to Martha in the barn. He held out a heavy leather pouch. "It's $500, he said. "More than I promised. It's enough to take you anywhere. San Francisco, Denver, back east. You can start over. A real life. You've earned it." Martha looked at the money, then up at his face. He looked older, broken by the final, cruel twist of his own story. He had set out to rescue a memory, the smiling girl from the portrait. But people weren't portraits. They break. They change. "And what about you?" she asked. "Will you stay here?" "This is all I have left," he said, gesturing to the house, the land, "my monument to failure." Martha thought about her old life, the frightened, helpless girl on the auction block. That girl was gone, burned away in the fire of that terrible night. She was someone else now. She had faced down murderers. She had taken a life to save another. She was a survivor. She looked at this broken man in front of her. He had used her, manipulated her, put her life in mortal danger. But he had also, in his own twisted way, been fighting for love. He wasn't the cold, hard man she had first met. He was just a man, full of flaws and regrets. And despite everything, she felt a strange pull towards him. Not of pity, but of understanding. They were both survivors of Jacob Thornton's war. "I don't want your money, Jacob," she said, pushing the pouch back towards him. He looked confused. "But I promised." "You promised me a fresh start," she said. "A job as a housekeeper." She looked towards the main house, now dark and empty. "It seems to me you still have a house that needs a woman's touch." A flicker of something, hope, surprise, danced in his tired eyes. "Martha, after everything I did to you, why would you stay?" "Because maybe," she said, a small, tentative smile touching her lips for the first time in weeks, "we both deserve to remember how to live again, and maybe we can't do that alone." He didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at her, this impossible woman who had walked through the fire he had created and come out stronger on the other side. He had bought her to be a ghost, a reflection of a love he had lost. But she wasn't a ghost. She was real, and she was offering him not a past to reclaim, but a future to build. Slowly he nodded. "The house is a mess," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know," she said, "but it's got potential." The years that followed weren't easy. There were ghosts in the house, memories that had to be confronted and put to rest. But slowly together, Jacob and Martha rebuilt. They didn't just rebuild the ranch, they rebuilt each other. They filled the empty, silent house with conversation, then with laughter, and eventually with love. A new love, born not of a shared past, but of a shared brutal trial by fire. They were married the following spring, in a quiet ceremony on the porch where so much blood had been shed. It was a reclaiming, a new beginning. They had children, a boy and a girl, who grew up strong and free under the vast prairie sky, with no knowledge of the darkness that had brought their parents together. One evening, years later, Martha sat on that same porch watching her children play as Jacob tended the horses. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in hues of pink and gold. She was no longer the girl on the auction block, or the decoy in a killer's trap. She was Martha Thornton, a wife, a mother, a partner. She had found her home. It had all started with a stranger whispering, "I'll take her." A stranger who had bought her for all the wrong reasons, but who, by some strange twist of fate, had turned out to be the right man after all. Now that you've heard the full story, we'd really appreciate it if you could rate it from 1 to 10 in the comments below. Your feedback helps us understand what you enjoy and helps us create even more stories for you. And if you want more tales with twists you'll never see coming, make sure you hit that subscribe button.